Sinema.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary, for being here today. In 2022, we saw a record number of encounters at our southwest border, over 2.5 million individuals. While just under half of these migrants were removed under Title 42 authorities, the current system had multiple points of failure throughout last year. In Arizona, local governments were forced to step in to provide emergency support to avoid street releases and reassign staff from other important roles to help manage the release of migrants from CBP custody. Earlier this month, I led a bipartisan congressional delegation to the southwest border in Cochise County, Arizona, where we met with local leaders to hear how the ongoing border crisis affects their communities. And their message was clear: this crisis puts our border communities in danger. We heard from Cochise County Sheriff Mark Daniels about the issue of cartels recruiting young American teens, some as young as 14 years old, for dangerous smuggling operations along the border, and the need for my recently reintroduced bipartisan legislation, the Combating Cartels on Social Media Act. This legislation would establish and implement a national strategy to combat cartel recruitment activity on social media and other online platforms. The administration's continued failures on the border put Arizona communities and our national security at risk. The ongoing influx of migrants puts serious strain on DHS resources, and it forces Border Patrol agents out of the field and into processing and administrative roles. With the Title 42 termination imminent, I remain concerned that DHS is not ready. This is the same sentiment that I expressed at this same hearing last year, and unfortunately no action has been taken between now and then to change my opinion. And more importantly, the opinion of leaders in border communities who will be left to manage the fallout. So my first question for you, Secretary, I learned this morning that the Regional Center for Border Health, the only non-governmental organization operating in Yuma County, received a denial of reimbursement for a facility that they've been operating since 2021 from FEMA and the EFSP National Board. This denial could cause the regional center to shut down operations, which would be a disaster for Yuma County, but it would also be a disaster for Border Patrol. Will you commit to working with me to identify a path forward so that Yuma does not lose its only NGO providing support to these migrant families?
Senator, I'm not familiar with the Emergency Food and Shelter Program application of the organization that you identify and the denial of their request for reimbursement. I commit to you to look into that with you and to work with you to address it as best as we can. We're very grateful for Congress's plus up of the Emergency Food and Shelter Program to I believe the level of $800 million in total, and of course it's moving to the Shelter and Services Program in just a few months.
So thank you, Secretary. As you know, I worked very hard to ensure that funding was included in our recent omnibus, but denying that funding to the Regional Border Health Center in Yuma will literally mean that there is zero assistance for anyone in Yuma County. So I would like rapid follow-up to ensure that this community can continue to provide a safe transition and an orderly transition for those migrants. In December of 2022, migration surged due to the anticipated end of Title 42. Border Patrol encountered over 220,000 migrants just in that month. Many of these migrants were quickly expelled back to Mexico because of agreements with Mexico to accept removed individuals from certain countries. Arizonans are concerned about the status of these agreements once Title 42 authorities are rescinded in just a few weeks. Losing these agreements will drive additional migration. Is DHS working with the State Department and the government of Mexico so that they continue to accept these nationals from these countries after Title 42 ends?
Senator Sinema, we are indeed working with the government of Mexico. We are in active discussions with them. We are not only working with the government of Mexico, but we're working with other partner countries throughout the region to address migration that is at a level that is gripping the entire hemisphere, not just the southern border of the United States. You are correct in focusing on a regional solution to what is clearly a regional challenge.
On the CODEL that I recently led, Sheriff Daniels of Cochise County highlighted the dangers to his community associated with cartels targeting teenagers through social media apps. And Mayor McCaw of Sierra Vista shared how a recent chase ended outside of a local school. So my Combating Cartels on Social Media Act will help DHS counter this threat, and it'll work with social media companies to get cartel recruiters off of their platforms. Arizona communities cannot wait for this to play out on its own through the legislative process. So what is DHS doing today to solve this problem and protect American children in our border communities from this cartel criminal activity?
Senator, we are taking it to the cartels in unprecedented ways. We are working our Homeland Security investigations, personnel, the criminal investigative arm of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, has surged resources to address the cartels and the nefarious activity that they engage in, not just, of course, in Arizona, but across our southern border, on the Mexican side of that border, which is impacting our border communities. We are set up transnational criminal investigative units, for example, working with our Mexican counterparts and in other countries to address the cartels, to interdict them, their activities, to disrupt and dismantle their nefarious activities. They peddle in death and destruction, and we are working intensely to address them, and not alone, but also across this administration and with our partners to the south.
So at a hearing last year in this committee with social media executives, I secured commitments from TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to share their cartel recruitment information with DHS. My question for you, Secretary, is will you increase DHS's engagement back with those social media companies to ensure that they are held to the word that they gave me in this hearing, and so that they're doing their part to prevent cartels from recruiting teens along our southwest border?
Senator, what we do is we disseminate information. We broadcast it widely with respect to the threat streams that we are encountering, so individuals and organizations can be alert to those threat streams and take the action that they think warranted. Social media companies, of course, have terms of use. They are responsible for whether or not particular communications remain or are taken off their site. What we do is we alert the American public, including the business sector, to the threat streams that we are addressing so that they can take the action they deem appropriate.
Is there any attempt by DHS to hold those companies accountable for taking action when they receive information about cartel recruitment on these social media platforms?
Senator, that is not within our remit, but I look forward to studying your proposed legislation and continuing to work with our partners across the administration to ensure that the cartels are addressed in every facet that we can.
Mr. Chairman, I know my time has expired. I would just note that based on this communication, it seems evident to me that Congress will have to take action and pass this legislation. The administration will not, or is not interested in moving forward without accountability, without our legislation. So I'd encourage my colleagues to support the bill. Thank you. Recent bank failures, including those at Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, are textbook examples of executive incompetence, financial mismanagement, and incidentally, the brokenness in Washington. Both the Fed and the FDIC need to make meaningful cultural and operational changes to respond to problems faster and restore confidence in the system. I'm an original co-sponsor of the bipartisan bill, the Financial Regulators Transparency Act, alongside Senators Warren and Tillis and other members of this committee. This bill will ensure we can hold regulators accountable to the cultural and operational changes they've pledged to make. We'll discuss this more in Thursday's hearing. Today is about financial mismanagement by bank executives, which is where the lion's share of the blame should rest. Mr. Becker, thank you for being here. Page 6 of your testimony states that, quote, on the advice of Goldman Sachs, you decided to sell your AFS portfolio first. Did Silicon Valley Bank retain Goldman Sachs as a financial advisor or fiduciary?
Goldman Sachs was the investment bank that was running the transaction for us, so they were our advisor.
There's a news article today in the Financial Times where Goldman Sachs informed SVB in writing, quote, we would not act as their advisor on the sale, and SVB should not rely on any advice from the bank in this regard, but instead hire a third-party financial advisor, end quote. Is that an accurate letter that you received from Goldman Sachs?
Senator, I don't remember reading that document.
Mr. Chair, I'll just submit this for the record. This is an article in the Financial Times today, Goldman Sachs provided this information to SVB in writing. So the way you phrased your testimony implies that Goldman Sachs advised you to sell the portfolio like a financial advisor would. But we see here there was a letter where they were not retained as a financial advisor or fiduciary. If they were, you would have a contract. So it seems like they were acting in a principal capacity, perhaps as a bidder for the assets. Did SVB have a financial advisor advising on this transaction in March of 2023?
Senator, the sole investment bank that we were working with at that time was Goldman Sachs.
Okay, so either Goldman Sachs did write a letter saying that they would not be your advisor on the sale, or they did. So what did Goldman Sachs advise you in this contract that we're not sure exists and that Goldman Sachs says does not exist?
Senator, the only thing I can do is give my memory of what happened. And again, I don't have access to the bank documents, but my memory is very clear. It was, as we were looking to do two things. One is raise equity, and the second one is to sell all or a portion of our AFS portfolio. Goldman Sachs was the investment bank we worked with on both. And as we were having the discussion with our board of directors, or specifically the special committee of the board that was really the ones working with the management team on this, the direct feedback that we received from Goldman Sachs is that to show the purpose for the fundraise, the capital raise, because otherwise our capital ratios and liquidity was strong, we would need to sell the securities first to show the loss and then to bring the capital on board later that day or the next few days.
And was Goldman Sachs your advisor on that sale?
On the sale of the securities?
That you're just describing, yes.
Goldman Sachs was the investment bank that we worked with on that.
Mr. Chair, it might be useful to try and get a hold of this letter because Goldman Sachs says that they informed SVB in writing that they would not be the advisor on this sale. Your testimony faults the interest rate environment for your failure, but I find it fascinating that other institutions, all of which were dealing with the same interest rate increases, seems to have hedged better than SVB. So why do you think other banks survived in the same environment where your bank failed?
Senator, as I tried to describe in my written testimony, I actually think the unrealized losses across the banking sector, just the securities, but also, and I think this is not as well discussed, the loan portfolio. So when banks have loans that are longer duration, those unrealized losses exist. I tried to highlight the fact that our loan portfolio is short duration and was variable rate, 90% of it. So when you look at the entire balance sheet and you look at duration and interest rate risk, I think you have to look at all the assets on a balance sheet. And so our loans would reprice every day or when rates would increase. So we benefited from that as rates went up. And so the discussion around the securities portfolio is because it was really offsetting the variable interest rates we had in our loan portfolio.
Senator Brett.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Arizona's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. The Federal Reserve's recent report is crystal clear. Despite what you may hear from some in Washington, the Fed knew Silicon Valley Bank was in trouble, had all the tools to fix it, and failed to respond in time. Furthermore, the FDIC's recent self-assessment on how Signature Bank failed on its watch was deeply alarming. I'm particularly concerned about the acute shortage of bank examiners at the FDIC. Chair Grunberg, Vice Chair Barr, I have questions for both of you today, but since I have several and limited time, please keep your answers concise and specific to 20 seconds. I will interrupt to keep things going if needed, and we can follow up if we need to. So first, for Chair Grunberg, let's start there. My understanding is that examiner staffing is measured in hours, and that the New York region, where Signature was based, particularly struggles to recruit and retain qualified bank examiners. If the FDIC's New York region is understaffed, this may not be an isolated incident. Are you confident that other banks in the region are being adequately supervised and examined?
I believe they are, Senator.
Since you are able to set your own budget, I'd like to know what you're doing to fix the issue in New York and in other regions where it exists. I believe your staff is briefing my staff on this issue. I look forward to following up after the briefing. Now, Vice Chair Barr, it's good to see you. I was pleased to see you acknowledge the need for cultural and operational changes at the Fed, but the report was light on details. I recognize you're on a tight deadline, but now that the report is public, it's time to get specific with our goals, roll up our sleeves, and get to work. With respect to cultural and operational changes at the Federal Reserve, how are you defining success?
I think we need to have a workforce that's agile, that acts quickly and acts forcefully to prevent these kinds of problems in the future.
And how fast will you achieve that?
I think it will take time. I think cultural change is difficult, but I've started that work already and I'm committed to getting it done.
But you have no timeline.
I do not currently have a timeline. That's the next step in the process after the SVB report was released, was to develop detailed work plans.
And I think that's what we need, are specific metrics, rather than just a focus on outcomes, which say more about a business cycle. What we're interested in is a well-designed regulatory process. So here's a metric. Turnaround time is a problem at the Federal Reserve. The examiners found serious problems at Silicon Valley Bank, but the regulators were fatally late in responding. So following an examination finding, what is the median turnaround time for a Fed regulatory response?
Senator, I would say the bank was fatally late in responding to the supervisor's concerns. And when they were late, the supervisors did not escalate fast enough. The timing depends on the precise nature of the finding, so I can't give you an answer that would be generalizable.
Well, I understand you don't have an answer today, and that's all right. But I would like to get a more specific answer. More importantly, I'd like to know what you'd like the answer to be. Is it the answer, what will it be a year from now? What will the answer be 3 years from now? What will the answer be 5 years from now? Bank runs are happening faster than ever, and we need regulatory processes that can operate at the speed of business. In your last appearance before this committee, you and I spoke about how sometimes the length was 6 weeks between times of communication, including sending the communication through mail. We don't really live in that kind of a slow world anymore. When a bank run can occur in 4 hours, we probably should stop communicating over snail mail. So I recognize that the Fed must balance the need to be responsive with its historically deliberative approach to complex issues. So have you identified other metrics that will be used to measure success when enacting lasting cultural and operational change? And if so, what are those metrics?
As I said, Senator, the next phase in the process is to develop detailed work plans, and for each of those work plans, there will be metrics, but I don't have those for you today.
You don't even have general guidelines around what the metrics could be?
The three things, as I said, that we're most focused on in terms of supervision are increasing the agility of our workforce, increasing the speed of action, and increasing the forcefulness of action. And those will be, at a high level, the things that we're going to be looking for.
Thank you. So a couple quick questions for you. Who is leading this process of transformation work at the Fed?
I am responsible for it.
And are you delegating it?
I am responsible for it. I will, of course, have a large team of people who are working with me to get that done.
And will there be staff at the Fed working full-time on this issue? Or is this something where you'll be retaining consulting services to help you develop and execute a plan?
We'll both be using internal staff as well as external supports, including consulting services, to do that.
And as you're funded independently of Congress, how much budget are you allocating for this work and for how long?
We have not detailed a detailed budget plan at this time. As I said, that would be the next phase of the project, is to develop those detailed work plans, to find the appropriate staffing and make sure we have the resources that are charged against that task.
And Vice Chair Barr, as you develop that plan, will you commit to releasing that plan to the American public and to members of this committee, including specific measurable goals, so that we can determine if your efforts have been successful in achieving these cultural and operational changes?
I would be happy to come back up to the committee, of course, at any time.
Would you be willing to commit to a quarterly basis of reporting to this committee?
I'd be happy to work with your office to find the appropriate timing and pacing of coming back to discuss this with you and the committee.
Thank you, Vice Chair. The next time we meet, I expect greater specificity from you and reports of progress that we've made in these areas. I appreciate your work, and I thank you for your service. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Sinema. This concludes the hearing. We all seem to agree that supervisors need to hold banks accountable to the rules that are supposed to keep our banking system safe. I think Senator Sinema's questions were right on that.
I recognize myself. Chairman Gensler, it's good to see you. I have several questions for you today and limited time, so please keep your answers concise and specific. I hope I don't have to, but I will interrupt if needed to keep moving on. A year ago, in October 22, the SEC's Office of IG provided its annual report on the most serious management and performance challenges at your agency. Members of various divisions in your organization raised concerns about resource management due to the increase in the SEC's rulemaking activities. As we've discussed, I appreciate your desire to protect consumers and investors and your goal of ensuring that the U.S. capital markets remain the most sophisticated and best in class. These are broad goals that are good for business and good for our country, but how we accomplish those goals matters. The IG report illustrates an SEC with a marked increase in attrition, difficulty in hiring qualified talent, and over-reliance on detailees with no rulemaking experience. These are fundamental problems that call into question the quality of rulemaking that the agency is capable of producing. Now, ambitious agendas under these constraints can result in poorly written rules that can hurt Arizona's access to economic opportunity. So what have you done since October of 22 to address these management challenges?
Part of it is, with Congress's help, is hiring more people. I'm very proud to say that the partnership of partnership of public service actually looked at us, and we went up in the ratings, that we're the third highest rated agency. But you're right, our attrition has moved up, and our attrition moved up in part because it's a very tight job market, and we're about 6 or 7% attrition. That means the average employee stays about 16 years.
I'd like my staff to be briefed by your staff in terms of the specific progress that you've made. So I'll have my team follow up with you.
I thank you for that.
Your own division managers raise these bandwidth concerns with the IG, and do you assess whether or not a division has adequate bandwidth to conduct a particular rulemaking before directing them to engage in that rulemaking? And if so, how do you make that assessment?
We do it with each of the main divisions: investment management, trading and markets, corporate finance, have a rule team. And we do that with the leads of those rule teams that are career staff. And we also do it with the Division of Economic Risk Analysis about their bandwidth, as you say, in each of those groups.
The IG report also cites shortened timelines during the drafting process and shortened public comment periods as factors that your staff indicate may be resulting in less feedback during this process. We've spoken about this before. I want to ensure that stakeholders and the public have time to weigh in on these actions. As we've discussed, more sophisticated firms have armies of attorneys on retainer, but small businesses and retail investors need more than 30 days or 60 days to understand the impact on their business and provide feedback, particularly since these rulemakings are very complex and there are multiple rulemaking processes happening at the same time. So does your agency value hearing from small businesses and retail investors, and how are you ensuring that they have adequate time and the use of their own resources to provide feedback on your agency's actions?
We do value the input of small businesses, of everyday investors. We reach out in many ways through social media and elsewhere to try to encourage people to comment on our rules. And I would note this for the public: whether large, sophisticated investors or everyday investors, we continue to take meetings and continue to get comments during these what's generally 1 to 2 year processes, and they are very beneficial to us.
The SEC staff also raised concerns that the increase in rulemaking activities had resulted in a trade-off in other mission-related work because they've had to borrow staff to do their work. Has bandwidth allocated to increase rulemaking traded off with your bandwidth for enforcement?
I think the biggest trade-off is that we shrank from 2016 to 2021, and we're only right now about 3% larger than we were 7 years ago. But our enforcement division of about 1,300 people, which is about a quarter of our overall staff, it's not a trade-off because our policy shops are in different parts of the agency.
So my last question is, your staff raised concerns with the IG that when moving more aggressively with rulemaking, the SEC is opening itself up to increased litigation risk. We've seen some recent legal setbacks for the agency, particularly in respect to cryptocurrency. So how are you assessing the agency's litigation risk with respect to the breadth of your rulemaking strategy?
We take Congress's mandates to us and the authorities we have very seriously, but also how the courts interpret them. And we're dedicated and committed to doing things just within our authorities and how the courts interpret it, but we get a lot of feedback also from the public on that.
My time's expired. I'll follow up in further questions later.
Sinema, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Fiscal year 2023 saw a record number of encounters in the Tucson sector, over 350,000 individuals. Arizona continues to bear the brunt of the federal government's failure on the border. For years now, Arizona communities have stepped up to do the federal government's job and manage migrants released from CBP facilities. But recently, that problem has become even worse. Since September 12th of this year, over 10,000 migrants have been released into small communities across Arizona. These communities have been forced to step in to provide emergency support to migrants without sufficient resources. In Bisbee, a town of about 5,000 people without bus service to either Tucson or Phoenix, local leaders turned the city council chambers into an emergency shelter so that migrants would no longer be dumped in a grocery store parking lot. Now, this is not the time for partisan rhetoric. Our current system is not working, and communities and migrants are suffering. Our communities are in crisis, and dangerous drugs like fentanyl are killing thousands of Americans each year. We must make meaningful, lasting change to solve these issues and secure our border, keep Arizona families safe, and ensure that migrants are treated fairly and humanely. My first question is for you, Secretary Mayorkas. Since September, the southwest border was so overwhelmed by migrant encounters that CBP has reassigned port officers from southwest border land ports of entry to help process migrants. These reassignments have increased wait times at Arizona ports, and operations were recently suspended at the Bridge of Americas port in Texas. Reassigning port officers hinders legal trade and travel between the U.S. and Mexico and has an immediate impact on the economies of border states. Our border ports are already under strain from the border crisis because they're processing hundreds of migrants each day. They cannot afford to lose more officers. So what steps is DHS taking to return Southwest Border Port officers to their ports and to prevent the need for such reassignments in the future?
Senator, thank you very much. And you and I have spoken about the challenge in the Tucson sector. We're taking a number of steps. Number one, we achieved an enforcement milestone in negotiating with Venezuela, our ability to repatriate Venezuelan nationals who do not qualify for relief in the United States. Since then, we have seen a significant drop in the number of individuals from Venezuela encountered at our southern border. Two, we have sought from Congress additional funds for the hiring of additional field office personnel in Customs and Border Protection and other resources to address the chronically underfunded U.S. Customs and Border Protection and other federal agencies. And three, we are hopeful that the broken immigration system under which we operate will be fixed.
Thank you. As you know, Arizona communities are at a breaking point. We don't have sufficient resources to handle the high numbers of migrants, and the Shelter and Services Program is not doing enough to support them. One of the major issues is that FEMA is not allowing any margin of error for A numbers. We've spoken about this before. With so many migrants being released each day, the NGOs are struggling to keep up, and there's a natural amount of human error. FEMA has stated that there's no allowance for human error, and anytime there's a mistake in an A number, the NGO does not receive reimbursement for services for that migrant. Additionally, handling sensitive A numbers without any guidelines or best practices creates significant liability for Arizona's NGOs. As you and I have spoken, I've requested that FEMA, and indeed said that they must, include a 3 to 5% allowance for a margin of error for recording A numbers. FEMA must also include guidance for NGOs on how to safely handle this sensitive information. Is this something that DHS can administer and implement administratively? And if so, will you commit to working with me to support the NGO network in protecting confidentiality and providing services?
Senator, I do commit to working with you, to continuing to work with you on this issue. There is a tension here. On the one hand, you correctly identify the potential for human error and how we need to accommodate for that. On the other hand, what we do not want to do is distribute funds to an organization for the processing of an individual who has evaded law enforcement and not been processed and put into immigration enforcement proceedings. We will work with you, and you have my commitment.
Thank you. This question is for the panel. Earlier this month, the FBI and DHS issued a joint public service announcement warning of an increase of reports of threats against Jewish, Muslim, and Arab communities and institutions due to the horrific terrorist attack in Israel and the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. From the senseless murder of a 6-year-old boy in Illinois to over 300 recorded anti-Semitic incidents between October 7th and October 23rd, hate and the threat of hate-based violence is exploding across the country. Director Wray, what additional steps is the FBA taking to track hate-based violence across the United States, and what additional support do you need from Congress? And for Secretary Mayorkas and Director Abizade, I was not close at all. How does the accuracy of data regarding hate-based violence or threats of violence help your organizations better protect the U.S.? Director Wray.
So we've done a number of things. First, we've increased the outreach to state and local law enforcement and others to improve the reporting of hate crimes, as well as outreach to faith-based communities, because one of the things we know about hate crimes is that they're chronically underreported. So we've had a lot of engagement there, and that undoubtedly contributes to the increase in reported hate crimes. But in addition to that, we've created a domestic terrorism hate crimes fusion cell to try to get at offenses, hate-based violent extremist offenses against the faith-based communities, which could be either domestic terrorism or hate crimes. And so the idea was to bring the expertise of both together. That has in turn led to some of the first proactive hate crimes cases, including in particular, the one that I can think of is a disruption of an attempted bombing of a synagogue. So we've had a number of cases like that that we're doing. So we've also elevated hate crimes to a national threat priority. So it's extensive outreach to faith-based communities, and it's extensive investigations. Just in the few years that I've been director, we've had quite a number of attacks or attempted attacks on synagogues that we have disrupted. Attempted bombings of synagogues in Colorado and Nevada, attempted shootings up of synagogues in California. Obviously, we had the Colleyville situation. I personally have been to the crime scene at Tree of Life. So it is a major problem and something we're actively engaged in.
Forgive me, Senator, the tracking of information enables us to most ably and efficiently allocate the resources we have to the communities most in need at a particular time.
And Senator, our organization is focused on the foreign nexus of a threat, and anything that helps us better understand what's happening here domestically and understand it in the context of the global environment is critically important. So whether that's racially or ethnically motivated violent extremist attacks here, in Brazil, in Bratislava, whether that's Al-Qaeda or ISIS-inspired terrorist attacks here or in any other part of the world, that total picture of the global threat environment is absolutely critical to our understanding.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Sinema.
Thank you both for your service.
Thank you. Senator Sinema.
Thank you, Chair Murray and Vice Chair Collins, for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. The southwest border is in crisis. Arizona continues to bear the brunt of the federal government's failures on the border, and the situation is only getting worse. Since September 12th of this year, over 14,000 migrants have been released into small communities across Arizona. These small communities do not have the resources or transportation options to handle migrant releases. In Bisbee, a town of about 5,000 people without bus service to either Tucson or Phoenix, local leaders turned the council chambers into an emergency shelter so that migrants would no longer be dumped in a grocery store parking lot. So now is not the time for partisan rhetoric. Our system isn't working. Arizonans and migrants are suffering. Our communities are in crisis. Dangerous drugs like fentanyl are killing thousands of Americans each year, and we have to reject the partisan echo chamber and work together to make meaningful, lasting changes to solve these issues, to secure our border, keep Arizona families safe, and ensure that migrants are treated fairly and humanely. Secretary Mayorkas, in February of 2022, DHS formed the Southwest Border Coordination Center to coordinate planning, operations, engagement, and interagency support. While the SBCC didn't do nearly enough to help with resource coordination, they did relay helpful information to my office, and they answered questions in weekly meetings. But last week, my staff was informed that the SBC is standing down. These weekly meetings are ending, which is making it more difficult for my staff to get updates on the situation in the Yuma and Tucson sectors. This is especially concerning given the increasing number of ongoing migrant releases in small southern Arizona communities. Will you commit to restarting these weekly meetings between CBP and my office so we can get these regular updates and ensure that our questions are answered in a timely manner?
Senator, I look forward to working with you because the Southern Border Coordinating Center was ended, but we are institutionalizing the means of communicating with local jurisdictions. We are institutionalizing further all of the mission sets that the SBCC was performing. So I will follow up with you and get back to you immediately because the communication is key with communities impacted by the influx of individuals at the border.
Okay, we'll follow up because we need a meeting every week. The current levels of migration are unprecedented and unsustainable. We've got to send a clear message to potential migrants that we will be fair and humane, but that we will secure our border and enforce our laws. Many countries are refusing to take back their nationals even after they've gotten a final removal order from the U.S. These recalcitrant countries undermine our ability to enforce our immigration laws. So what is DHS doing to get these countries to accept their nationals back? And what authorities do you need from us in Congress to more effectively compel the countries to get their citizens returned to them?
The challenge of recalcitrant jurisdictions, Senator, has been one that is decades long. I worked on it back in 2009, and quite frankly, when I was a prosecutor, a federal prosecutor in the 1990s, it was a challenge then. And we are working, not just the Department of Homeland Security alone, but working very closely with the Department of State in an all-of-administration effort to get recalcitrant jurisdictions to accept the repatriation of their nationals. In fact, we reached a milestone in that regard with respect to Venezuela, where a few weeks ago we negotiated an agreement successfully, and Venezuela agreed to take back individuals from its country who did not qualify for relief in the United States. So this is a persistent challenge and one that we are attacking persistently.
But Secretary, what do you need from Congress? What additional authority would you need from us in order to be able to return these people more rapidly?
It is really a matter of international relations, but Senator, let me pose that question to our experts and get back to you.
The Family Expedited Removal Management Program, which is called FIRM, ensures that migrant families undergo their credible fear interviews in a timely manner. We know that the stated goal is to remove families within 30 days if they don't articulate a credible fear. How many family units have been enrolled in the FIRM, and how many have been removed to their country of origin? And how many days does the process take?
I will get that data to you. I can share with you the top line that we have succeeded in removing more family members than the prior administration, and I will get that data to you.
The last few months have shown that many of our ports of entry don't have the necessary staffing or infrastructure to process the very high number of migrants that are coming in through our ports of entry, while also facilitating trade and travel. What additional resources is DHS putting in place at ports of entry to ensure that trade and travel continues while migrants are being processed?
Senator, it's such an important issue that you raised, and one that we have spoken about previously. Our supplemental funding request, which is so urgently needed, seeks, I think it's $240 million for 1,000 new CBP officers from the Office of Field Operations, which work our ports of entry.
And Chairwoman, I know that my time has expired. One last comment I'll make. It's obvious that DHS needs additional resources to help this process move forward. I would encourage the Department of Homeland Security and the administration to also recognize what I think is fairly obvious, which is that policy must be changed in order for us to get control of the situation on the border. The number of migrants who are crossing into just my small state alone every day is 8 to 10 times as much as it was under the Obama administration. Without policy changes, the cartels will continue to decide who enters our country through what ports and what times. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I want to thank all of our colleagues who participated today. I want to thank Secretary Becerra, Secretary Mayorkas. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being here today. Senator Collins, would you like to make any closing